There's a very impressive lineup on BBC2 now in The Shooting Party. It was James Mason's last film, and the actors with him in this study of the end of an era include Edward Fox, Robert Hardy, Cheryl Campbell, Dorothy Tewton and John Gielgud. In 15 minutes here on One, Everyman looks at one particular home for handicapped young people, an example of the ever-increasing demand and dependence on charity. First, the news with Lisa Davidson.
Mrs. Thatcher has warned against a revenge attack on those responsible for the Pan Am disaster. As the search for evidence continued, the police denied a husband's accusation that they'd taken too long to deal with the bodies. And in Rio de Janeiro, over 100 New Year revelers are drowned or missing after a pleasure boat sinks. The Prime Minister has distanced herself from American calls for retaliation against those who planted a bomb on Pan Am Flight 103. She said there should be no eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth revenge. Mrs. Thatcher said she didn't think such revenge was ever valid. In Lockerbie, police have denied complaints that they're taking too long to hand back the bodies of crash victims to their families. The search for evidence continued over the weekend, in which traditional New Year celebrations were lost in mourning.
For 10 days, time has stood still in Lockerbie. When the years ended and began, it was in silence. Normally with the chimes, doors are opened to welcome friends. But in the flower garden of remembrance that's grown on the pavement, there are too many reminders of friends who are gone. At the school, investigators in this massive murder hunt worked on. But New Year's Day brought criticism of them from a Pan Am pilot, whose wife, Ingrid, was a passenger on Flight 103.
We need to have a time. We need to know they've found our people, and we need to know when we're going to get them back. Even if it's going to be 3 weeks, 3 days, or 3 months. At the moment, it's no comment. They can't tell us, or at least they say they can't tell us anything.
What do you think about the people who are leading the inquiry? Do you want to see it handed over to another body?
I am dissatisfied with the way it's being conducted, and perhaps some other body which is more accustomed to dealing with major events of this sort could get the job done faster.
I'm sure that nobody would thank me for shortcutting any legal or evidential gathering process, which may at the end of the day help to bring the persons or persons to justice.
The charred ruins that were Sherwood Crescent yielded one more body yesterday. The police will look there no longer. Despite the enormous amount of wreckage that's already been gathered together, 2/3 of the Pan Am jumbo jet still lie scattered over 200 square miles. Pieces of the aircraft have also been spotted in one of Britain's biggest forests, 40 miles away.
Mrs. Thatcher's rejection of direct retaliation against the terrorists distances her from both President Reagan and President-elect Bush. They have indicated that they would consider a revenge attack if the perpetrators could be identified.
I don't think an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth is ever valid. I can understand the anger. We feel the anger very deeply. The most important thing to do is to try to get the cooperation of all nations to track these people down so that they are brought to justice. So they shouldn't be a safe haven, they shouldn't escape. I think public opinion is having its effect on most nations. I think public opinion is disgusted with nations that will not try to track down terrorists. Absolutely disgusted.
The Libyan leader, Colonel Gaddafi, has denied that his country was responsible for sabotaging the Pan Am airliner. He was interviewed on television in Tripoli, and when asked about the disaster, he replied, "We've got nothing to do with that." Yasser Arafat's reported offer to give PLO help in tracking down those who brought down the Pan Am plane has been welcomed by the FBI. Meanwhile, airports in Athens and other Mediterranean cities have been warned to be on the alert for terrorists travelling with false passports. The American Federal Aviation Authority Administrator Alan McCarter said he believed there was a general threat to civil aircraft, not just to American airlines. He said there was a movement of some known terrorists who had in their possession false passports. This was an alert to the Athens area and to other airports in the Mediterranean as well. In Brazil, 50 people have drowned and another 50 are still missing after a pleasure boat capsized off Rio de Janeiro. The accident happened within sight of Sugarloaf Mountain, just off Copacabana Beach. 30 people were rescued alive. There are no reports of any British casualties.
The boat had been crowded with tourists and families who'd paid $150 each to celebrate the New Year aboard. The survivors were brought ashore while New Year celebrations went on, but it wasn't really till daybreak that the full extent of the disaster became clear as more and more bodies were found. The boat went down just beyond Rio's famous landmark, the Sugarloaf Mountain. One of the survivors described how the boat tilted, sweeping chairs, tables and passengers into the sea, and then overturned completely. Throughout the day, firemen recovered more bodies from the sea. They were taken back to shore to the city mortuary. There, survivors and relatives searched for missing wives, husbands and children. The two-tier cruiser, one of a fleet, had been stopped by Port Authority police because the sea was very rough and she was carrying too many passengers. The boat was turned back, but for some reason was allowed to go out again, still overloaded.
The New Year celebrations were marred by violence in several parts of the country. A man and a woman were found dead at Catterick Camp in Yorkshire after an argument following a party. The woman's husband is in hospital. At Canvey Island in Essex, a youth of 18 died from a stab wound during a disturbance. At East Dereham in Norfolk, 7 policemen were hurt in a battle with youths. At Falmouth in Cornwall, 5 police were injured in a similar incident. And at Tredegar in Gwent, 4 officers were slightly hurt when fighting broke out among 600 revellers. Gary Lloyd reports.
The new year was ushered in here with a pitched battle between police and about 200 revellers. 7 officers were hurt and police cars took some of the brunt of bricks and stones. The violence followed arrests for alleged vandalism to the town's Christmas tree.
When the disco closed, 2 people climbed the tree and the coppers let them go up the tree. And as soon as they come down, they arrested them. And as soon as they were arrested, one done a runner and the other lad was held on the floor by 6 coppers surrounding him, and everyone just went berserk.
Outside this pub, 7 people were injured, one of them seriously, when they were hit by a Land Rover as they sang Auld Lang Syne. An estimated 65,000 people packed Trafalgar Square, and though there were scores of arrests and hospital treatment for minor injuries, they were fewer than last year. Police discouraged revellers from bringing drink with them. They said behaviour had improved. The countdown to New Year in Times Square. As revellers romped, the American and Soviet presidents exchanged goodwill greetings. Mr. Reagan said the world was now a safer place. And as Soviet citizens celebrated, Mr. Gorbachev said fears and suspicions between East and West were giving way to trust and mutual liking. The Pope was also among world leaders to express hopes for compassion and reconciliation. Some Romans insisted on more robust ways to welcome the new year, with ritual ablutions in the river Tiber.
The Israeli government has announced an austerity program to combat inflation and revive the economy. The shekel has been devalued by 12%. There have been sweeping cuts in subsidies, and thousands of civil servants are to lose their jobs. At the same time, in the occupied territories, the Israelis have expelled another 13 Palestinians, bringing the total number of expulsions to 45 since the uprising began over a year ago.
The uprising by Palestinians against Israeli occupation is taking its toll, and Israelis are being called upon to pay the price of maintaining a major military commitment against the Palestinians, of a large drop in tourism because of the violence, of a boycott of Israeli goods by Palestinians, all of which have cost the country dear. Finance Minister Shimon Peres has only been in his new post a few days, but this is his second devaluation of the shekel as he attempts to stop the slide into economic chaos. He's also announced that thousands of jobs in the civil service are to go and that subsidies on essentials like petrol, bread and milk will be cut, leading to big price rises, and that's only the start. He wants major cuts in defence and education, and with inflation at 17% and rising, he wants them quickly. But he's certain to run into opposition that will put a major strain on the coalition government within days of it being formed.
31 years ago, Harold Macmillan's Conservative government faced a crisis after the Chancellor and 2 Treasury ministers resigned over public spending cuts. At the time, Macmillan described it as a little local difficulty. Today, confidential cabinet papers released under the 30-year rule reveal the true depth of his anxiety. Our political correspondent, Hugh Edwards, looks back.
Peter Thornycroft resigned as Chancellor 31 years ago after cabinet colleagues rejected his demands for more cuts in public spending.
For 12 years, prices have steadily gone up, and I thought it was time to make a stand.
The Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, leaving for a tour of the Commonwealth the next day, managed to quell the storm by using his familiar, relaxed approach and giving the impression that there were far more significant matters needing attention.
So I thought the best thing to do was to settle up these little local difficulties and then turn to the wider vision of the Commonwealth.
But secret telegrams sent by the Prime Minister and published today for the first time show the true extent of his concern. He admits the resignations were a very serious shock and refers to those difficult days. He thanks the party for its loyalty and support in this critical period. One of the ministers who resigned with the Chancellor remains unrepentant.
There are very few people today, I believe, who would dispute, but if a public sector borrowing requirement had been controlled in the intervening years, as Chancellor Thornycroft was determined on controlling it, we should not have experienced the disastrous fluctuations and the disastrous peaks of inflation by which we have been plagued in the intervening 30 years.
The founder of the Common Cold Research Unit, Sir Christopher Andrews, has died at the age of 92. He made it his life's work to try to find the cure that would end the suffering of millions.
Now, these specimens of flu virus have been sent in from Paris.
As a junior doctor, Sir Christopher was one of a team of 3 who successfully isolated the flu virus. After the war, he founded the Common Cold Research Unit at Salisbury, believing at the time that he could find a cure within 2 years. But the complexity of the task soon became apparent. The unit's research has revealed 200 strains of virus, all of them minute.
Now, here is a perfectly good hair. It would take about 600 influenza virus particles in a row to reach across the width of my hair.
Dr. David Tyrrell, who now runs the Common Cold Research Unit, this evening described the professor as a world leader in his field. Sir Christopher pioneered the use of human beings in his research, a practice which continues today. 18,000 volunteers are now believed to have spent time in isolation at the unit. But a cold cure remains elusive, and the centre is to close next year. It succeeded, though, in identifying many of the viruses which cause colds.
Back to the new year, and in France, the celebrations had a special significance, marking the start of the bicentenary of the French Revolution. During the year, the main events of 1789 will be relived on the streets of Paris, with the climax on July the 14th, the anniversary of the storming of the Bastille.
The Tuileries Gardens in the heart of Paris. Here and all over France, hot air balloons were launched to mark the 200th anniversary of a revolution that still echoes through French political and social life. The world's first hot air balloon took off from this same spot in 1783. The bicentennial is an opportunity for France to remember the glories of her past. And for the souvenir hunters, 300,000 first-day covers went on sale around the country today. It's also a time for re-evaluating history. French television has staged a live retrial of Louis XVI, condemned to the guillotine by a revolutionary court. The modern television audience voted that he should be acquitted. President Mitterrand has been accused of being too absorbed with the pomp of bicentennial celebrations. He hit back with a highly political New Year's message, calling for a change in the law to fight racism and for economic justice.
Vive la République. Vive la France.
Paris's most familiar monument celebrates its 100th anniversary this year. The Eiffel Tower has been dressed in lights for the occasion. The French people are preparing for a New Year's celebration that will last all year long.
And that's the news on New Year's Day. From the newsroom, good night.
Good evening to you. I think we're going to put a little bit more life in the weather charts in the days ahead. Not much life at the moment, still got high pressure on the scene here, so it's quiet and settled, the same old problem with that cloud. Now there's a fair bit of cloud around, at least there was a couple of hours or so back, but as you see there were one or two breaks, but the breaks are coming and going, and that's going to be the real problem, because every time a break comes along it doesn't take much for it to turn misty, or even for that mist to thicken up into fog, and it's going to be the nasty sort of fog that comes and goes, but basically just a misty, murky night really, with a lot of cloud around, some drizzle in the far north there of Scotland. Quite a mild night in most places, but again where those breaks last for any length of time, so the temperature dipping down close to freezing. And then tomorrow, well, dawning grey and misty, I think, in a good number of places, fairly murky as well. And generally speaking, I think we're in for a pretty cloudy day once again, but it will brighten up in a number of places as the day goes on, and the really lucky spots, sheltered areas, I would think, southeast Scotland, eastern England, for instance, ending up with perhaps just a glimpse or two of the sun, but basically most places staying pretty cloudy. And once again, the cloud thick enough in that northwestern part of Scotland to produce one or two spots of light rain and drizzle. Pretty breezy in northwestern Scotland as well. Temperatures again quite pleasant for the time of year, reasonably mild, although just a shade down on those of today. And that's all for now.
Forget the winter and come into the warmth on BBC1 when Clive James delivers a series of animated postcards from his favourite haunts. In Rio, he learns some fundamental truths.
And when he came to the city of San Sebastian of the River of January, called Rio de Janeiro, Christ said, "Lo, behold, and keep one hand on your wallet." I liked a lot about Rio. It scared me half to death, but I felt alive there. It wouldn't be a bad place to grow old, as long as it didn't happen overnight.
A postcard from Rio, delivered by Clive James on Wednesday at 9:30 on 1.
In 40 Minutes tonight, our movie classic is the story of a carefully planned, daring robbery, The Asphalt Jungle. But before we turn to fiction, some facts which provide food for thought in Everyman.